Avant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, la planète industrialisée fabriquait 1 million de tonnes de produits chimiques. Et en 2005, 500 millions. Entre les deux, la production de masse, la frénésie du progrès, le consumérisme des Trente Glorieuses, la magie pétrochimique qui invente le biberon incassable et les couverts en plastique.
Crude oil, like everything else, is made up of billions of tiny molecules. And using the magic of research, oil companies compete with each other in taking the petroleum molecule apart and rearranging it into, well, you name it, fabrics, toothbrushes, tires, insecticides, cosmetics, weed killers, a whole galaxy of things to make a better life on Earth.
We know that there are about 80 to 85,000 chemicals that are in commerce today, and about 7,000 high production, high volume chemicals. Most of these have not been tested for safety. So that's sort of the bottom line. But then you could say, so what? So they're manufactured, they're great, they make all these products that this little film showed. But the first thing to realize is that they actually get into our bodies, which I don't think was realized at that time.
The perspective is unlimited. There are unlimited potentials. Yes, if you forget your waste products and all of these chemicals that leach from the products, all of the contaminants, if you forget that. And that was the way we developed the modern world. We thought that everything is innocent until proven otherwise.
Nobody would have thought that we would have over 200 different chemicals in our blood. So because they're there doesn't mean that they're causing toxicity, but none of those chemicals belong there. So where do they all come from?
Les produits chimiques se sont mis à partager notre vie quotidienne, incrustés dans les plastiques, les détergents et les grille-pains, nichés dans les aliments, les boîtes de conserve, les jouets, les shampoings, invisibles et partout à la fois, y compris dans nos corps.
So, you know, I'm old enough. I watched this kind of thing. And in fact, when I was a child, they would come down the streets spraying DDT to kill the bugs. And as kids, we would run behind it and think that was great to have this spray in our face. So the reason I say that is at that time, there was not an indication at all that any of this would produce bad products.
We can find chemicals in the body pretty much everywhere we look. You can measure urine, that's a very good way to do that. You can look in the blood. You can look in the amniotic fluid of a pregnant woman. You can look at the cord blood when the baby's born, the meconium when the baby's born. You can look in the breast milk. Pretty much everywhere we look, we find measurable chemicals that come out of our environment. And important thing is that they are silent.
Le confort moderne se balade dans nos veines sous des noms strictement inconnus et parfaitement barbares. La grande famille des pesticides, du dichloro-diphényltrichloroéthane, le DDT, à l'atrazine, phtalate, bisphénol A, parabène, diphényléther polybromé, acide de perfluorooctane. Une pollution invisible, continue, qui intoxique l'humanité en toute discrétion et à domicile.
With the infatuation with modern products, we see the demand for them and then the production of them and the onslaught of these chemicals into our lives. I could ask you, are you a smoker? Are you, do you drink alcohol? And then I would know some of your exposures. But if I asked you, are you consuming phthalates or are you consuming bisphenol A, how would you know that?
We live in a chemical world. Chemicals have uses. They are very useful. That's why they're there. The price we pay is we are exposed. There's only one way around this. We need a very rational approach to balance better risks to health and usefulness.
Raid's here! Raid! 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 Raid!
Yes, Raid. New bug killer discovery from Johnson's Wax.
Use Ajax,
Boom, boom.
the foaming cleanser.
Boom, 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 boom.
Gets things clean, just like a whiz. You'll start paying the elbow tax when you start cleaning with Ajax. So use Ajax.
Notre quotidien le plus banal est farci de produits chimiques qui s'échappent des objets. Et certains ont une caractéristique bien particulière. Ils peuvent cambrioler notre intimité hormonale, c'est-à-dire bloquer les hormones ou les imiter, donc altérer leur taux. On les appelle les perturbateurs endocriniens.
An endocrine disrupting chemical is a chemical that in some way interferes with the body's endocrine system. So that's the system that produces, regulates, and deals with the body's many hormones like estrogen, testosterone, thyroid, and so on. And so an endocrine disruptor can interfere with either how much is produced, how much is sent where it's supposed to go, if you will. They're messengers. They carry information from one organ to the other.
Les hormones naturelles sont fabriquées par le système endocrinien, c'est-à-dire l'hypothalamus, l'épiphyse et l'hypophyse dans le cerveau, la thyroïde, le thymus, les surrénales, le pancréas, les ovaires chez la femme, les testicules chez l'homme. L'adrénaline, par exemple, est une hormone qui participe à la gestion du stress. Un manque d'insuline peut causer du diabète.
Hormones are often highly potent, so these messages and signals have to be finely tuned. It's like, someone switches on a light and someone else has to switch it off again. So all these reactions on, off have to be very carefully controlled. And foreign chemicals that interfere with this in some way can have fairly drastic unwanted effects on our health.
Le corps sécrète de la testostérone, l'hormone sexuelle masculine, en quantité et en temps voulu. Ni plus ni moins. Haute précision. À minuscule quantité, grands effets. Mais les phtalates, par exemple, des perturbateurs endocriniens qu'on trouve dans les plastiques, peuvent duper le système hormonal et squatter ses mécanismes en bloquant l'action de la testostérone. Les perturbateurs endocriniens parasitent les manœuvres sophistiquées des hormones. Autant jouer du Chopin avec des moufles.
The study of endocrine disruptors is focused on what can go wrong when you introduce a hormonally active chemical into the body, a chemical that the body was not designed evolutionarily to deal with.
There is something wrong with the way we humans act
we don't see something, so we assume that it doesn't exist. So this chemical is good to make plastic, so let's use it. This chemical kills insects, so that is great. When we produce a chemical, we are going to test it for what we think we should. And if it's not in our imagination, if it doesn't cross our imagination, we won't do it.
There's a lot of established test systems, but with endocrine disruption, we have the problem that a lot of the effects we are concerned about are not answered by the available test systems.
When experiments, epidemiological experiments, reveal relationships between a chemical exposure and a disease, that was done in a way that you could separate the population that was exposed and the one that wasn't. Like, for example, people that apply pesticides in the fields versus people that live in the city. But when you talk about plastics, when you talk about things that are present in everyone's urine, in everyone's blood, then you don't have that luxury, because you cannot distinguish a non-exposed population and an exposed population to conduct these human studies.
It's this rapid adaptability, together with the attractiveness, usefulness, and low cost of the plastic itself, that has made this industry one of the fastest growing in the nation's history.
What's it to you?
Triomphe de la chimie, le plastique a progressivement envahi notre quotidien. La production des 10 dernières années dépasse celle de tout le XXe siècle. Mais le plastique recèle plusieurs types de perturbateurs endocriniens. Rendu célèbre par sa présence dans les biberons, le bisphénol A a pour inconvénient d'imiter l'œstrogène, l'hormone sexuelle féminine.
Some studies were conducted by the Center for Disease Control, for example, that found that more than 92% of the urines that they analyzed that correspond to a profile of the American population contained bisphenol A.
Le bisphénol A sert à fabriquer du polycarbonate et des résines époxy. Ingrédients des circuits imprimés, essuie-tout, vaisselle en plastique, prises, revêtements de sol, petits et gros électroménagers, réfrigérateurs, lave-linge, micro-ondes, mixeurs, aspirateurs, lave-vaisselle, meubles métalliques, tickets de caisse, de parking, d'avion, etc. Colles et adhésifs, bonbonnes d'eau, amalgames dentaires, emballages alimentaires, équipements automobiles, récipients en plastique, conserves et canettes, sèche-cheveux, lunettes de protection, casques de sport, raquettes, skis, outils de jardinage, appareils photo, lunettes, DVD, récipients de produits d'hygiène, gourdes, fer à repasser, télé, rasoir, ordinateur. En France, il est interdit dans les biberons.
The bottom line is that we cannot measure exposure and outcome in humans anymore because everyone is exposed through lifetime, and because we cannot integrate the daily exposures through a life to know whether there is a correlation. So we have to rely in animal studies.
No.
We expose animals in utero, as they were developing as fetuses, to minute amounts of bisphenol A. Then we follow all their development.
Exposés à cet oestrogène d'origine chimique, les bébés souris manifestent hyperactivité et troubles du comportement. Puis, en grandissant, deviennent obèses, développent des tumeurs des glandes mammaires et de la prostate, entre autres.
Now we have all this evidence in rats and mice that if you expose them to bisphenol A at minute, environmentally relevant doses, You increase the propensity, and at higher doses, you really produce cancer. The likelihood for a woman to develop breast cancer in her whole lifetime has increased from 1 in 22 in the 50s to 1 in 7 nowadays. That is threefold. So it can be done by modifying our gene composition. Obviously, this is a very short time. It has to be the environment.
People have asked for a long time, are diseases due to genetics or environment? And now we know that the answer is yes. It's due to both genetics and environment. So if we're going to understand the etiology of diseases, what causes diseases, we have to not just understand the genetics part, but we have to understand the role of an environment. And environment really covers environmental chemical exposures, nutrition, stress, drugs, and infections.
Well, we know that during development, for example, there are times where the developing organism is extremely sensitive to different kinds of chemicals exposure, both natural chemicals and synthetic chemicals. So while you might expose an adult to a chemical and have no effect at all, if you expose an embryo or a fetus or an infant, in fact, you might have an effect.
It turns out we now understand that the most sensitive period for nutrition and chemicals to have effects on disease is really during development.
The effects of chemicals are going to depend on the timing, they're going to depend on the dose, and they're going to depend on who's being exposed.
With an environmental chemical, just for a few days during development, then the chemical is long gone, but later in life, after a long latent period, these diseases show up. So it's called the developmental basis of disease, because we believe that almost all these diseases that we have today have their origins during development.
Chez les rats et les souris, en tout cas, c'est exactement ce qui se passe. Exposés pendant la grossesse à des perturbateurs endocriniens, ils développent hyperactivité et déficit d'apprentissage, résistance à l'insuline, prise de poids. Chez les femelles, cancer des glandes mammaires, anomalie des ovaires. Chez les mâles, cancer de la prostate, infertilité, anomalie génitale comme la descente incomplète des testicules dans les bourses. Or, chez les humains aussi, les maladies adultes peuvent s'amorcer dès la vie fœtale.
Since the cancer registry was opened in Denmark in 1943, there had been a 400% increase in the rate of testicular cancer. So that was an amazing increase over 1 or 2 generations, and such an increase could only be due to environmental problems. There was a lot of science which suggested that testicular cancer originated very early in life, and our hypothesis was that it originated in fetal life, actually, although it did not manifest itself as a tumor in the testis until in adulthood. The hypothesis of a fetal origin of testicular cancer has now received support from really many studies from all over the world. And what is also apparent is that testicular cancer development is associated with other abnormalities of the testis. And some of these abnormalities will be apparent just after birth. For instance, if the testis has not developed fully normally, it may not descend into the scrotum at birth. Or if the penis has not been fully developed, there may also be an increased risk of testis cancer. So you have a group of symptoms, diseases, you could say, that are associated. And we actually now call this testicular dysgenesis syndrome.
Un syndrome qui ne fait pas qu'augmenter dans les statistiques. Il va aussi de pair avec une baisse considérable de la fertilité. Environ 1% par an, soit moitié moins de spermatozoïdes en 50 ans. C'est marée basse dans les bourses du monde moderne.
So our hypothesis was that if you had hormones from outside coming into the testes and disturbing this delicate balance which is in the developing organ, then that could cause the same as genetic problems could.
Listen to the sounds of freshness.
Parmi les suspects, certains pesticides qui imitent les oestrogènes, mais aussi des ingrédients du plastique qui ont la fâcheuse propriété de bloquer la testostérone.
What has happened is that through this research we have become aware of new pathways in our bodies and new effects that weren't recognized before. A good example would be the plasticizers, the certain phthalates. They turn out to interfere with the action of male sex hormones in fetal life.
Les phtalates. Nous y sommes tous exposés. Via le plastique PVC et les rideaux de douche, revêtements plastifiés, tapis de sol, détergents, sprays, tissus imperméables, ballons, films alimentaires, fenêtres, adhésifs écoles, motifs sur vêtements, parfums, cosmétiques comme les rouges à lèvres et vernis à ongles, médicaments, shampoings, après-rasage, gel et lac pour cheveux, gants, Zodiac, jouets, matériel hospitalier, tongs, bottes, baskets, semelles, câbles et fils, insecticides, jusqu'aux tuyaux d'arrosage.
It turns out that the genital tract originally in the very, very early embryo is neutral. It's sex neutral. And then there's development and it differentiates to the female or the male. Well, the female is the default. This genital tract will be female unless there is testosterone present. And so the amount of testosterone and the timing of the testosterone is absolutely critical for setting up a whole series, a whole cascade of changes which produce the male typical genitals. If that testosterone is not there, or there's not enough of it, or it comes at the wrong time, all of this process can be disturbed. And that's what phthalates do. There was one measure that was particularly important to the rodent toxicologists, so we paid a lot of attention to that. And that's something called the anogenital distance, the distance from the anus to the genitals. In rodents, the male anogenital distance is twice as long as the female, on the average. And when the mother has been exposed to phthalates, that male anogenital distance is shortened. The higher the dose, the shorter the anogenital distance until it becomes close to the female size. We wondered whether that happened in humans.
Avec son équipe, Shanna Swan a mesuré les taux de phtalates chez plus de 100 femmes enceintes. Puis, quand les bébés sont nés, elle a soigneusement examiné les petits garçons à la recherche de signes de féminisation.
What we concluded was that certain phthalates, two in particular were particularly concerning, are strongly related to the anogenital distance, and they cause the boys who have this high exposure to these phthalates have a less male-typical genital tract and genitalia. So they have shorter anogenital distance, they have smaller penises, and their testicles are more likely to be not completely down in the scrotum. So these are three characteristics of the phthalate syndrome, three that we could look at externally.
Une autre famille de perturbateurs endocriniens est, quant à elle, soupçonnée de s'en prendre au cerveau et de provoquer dyslexie ou troubles de la mémoire et de l'attention chez les enfants. Ce sont les diphényléters polybromés, ou PBDE, des additifs qui retardent la progression du feu. Afin de respecter les normes anti-incendie, on en a truffé les objets inflammables et les plastiques à partir des années 70. Les PBDE se nichent dans les moquettes et tapis, lave-linge, cuisinières, hôtes, grille-pain, réfrigérateurs, batteurs, fer à repasser, lave-linge, micro-ondes, matelas, oreillers, radio-réveil, tuyaux, tentes, peintures, tissus d'ameublement et leur rembourrage, canapés, rideaux, chaises de bureau, circuits imprimés, fax, ordinateurs, imprimantes, les emballages de tout cela, ampoules, prises, câbles, piles, équipements de voiture, autoradio, batterie, ventilateur, sèche-cheveux, aspirateur, fer à friser, téléphone, téléviseur, télécommande, lecteur DVD, chaîne, radio, etc., etc.
Even in 1970, the levels of PBDEs in human either breast milk or blood were essentially non-detect, and that these levels increased very rapidly between 1970 and, say, 2000. To our surprise, the major route of exposure to these chemicals, at least in America, appears to be related to their presence in dust, house dust, office dust, car dust. When we think dust, we wonder how is it getting into people if it's in the dust? Well, little children we know are always putting their fingers in their mouth and they're crawling around on the floor. But in fact, dust gets into adults as well, and much of it has to do with people, consciously or not, putting their hands into their mouths.
There are animal toxicity studies that demonstrate that various flame retardants are neurotoxic. So essentially we have that evidence, but the problem is that animal brains are less complex than human brains, and we're not sure how to translate that evidence into risk assessment for humans.
The first studies are just being reported about the effects of the PBDEs in the human population, and what we're seeing in many cases mirror almost exactly the kinds of effects that we see in the animals. So I think it is reasonable to assume that the animal data is at least predictive or certainly suggestive of what may happen in people. After all, we are a kind of animal.
Many modern plastics, however, are fire resistant. One of the numerous improvements science has made in plastic articles.
It is going to take many, many years to get better evidence. Should we just wait, and in the meantime, we just expose the children to all of these chemicals, and then maybe we'll come back many years from now and find out that some of them were just as bad as lead.
Son extrême toxicité pour le cerveau n'a pas empêché le plomb de passer 60 ans dans les carburants de nos voitures, au prétexte que les preuves n'étaient pas suffisamment irréfutables. Oui, mais la recherche a besoin de temps, et les scientifiques ne sont pas des livreurs de pizza.
This model shows how just the right amount of fluid containing tetraethyl lead and dye is added to the gasoline.
With lead, it took decades to document that children were suffering from adverse effects on brain development. They were losing IQ points, losing various skills, memory, etc. And it took decades for us to get that information, and only now do we realize that lead is so toxic that essentially everybody in France, everybody in Europe, has a lead exposure that we cannot call safe. Even today, it's essentially a whole generation of children whose brains have been negatively affected. So all of these people who were born like in the 1960s and 1970s were to some degree affected by this pollution. Do we want this to happen again? I would say no. Therefore, we have to find a way to make responsible decisions in this regard on an uncertain basis.
Science is never 100% certain. You always have to make decisions in the face of some uncertainty. But it's important not to require 100% certainty before we move ahead. And I do think that scientists are citizens and have a responsibility to convey the results of their understanding to other people.
When you develop a brain, that is the brain you will have for the rest of your life. You get only one chance to develop your brain.
Voici donc la recette pour confectionner une maladie contemporaine. Faire mariner une masse de perturbateurs endocriniens dans les liquides amniotiques des années 50 et 60. Et quand les enfants de l'ère synthétique atteignent l'âge adulte, constater l'augmentation de certains problèmes de santé publique. Celui de l'obésité, notamment.
For obesity, the critical factors are how much you eat and how much you exercise. And of course, that's really important because that determines your energy balance. But we think that there's more to it.
Get set.
People try so hard to lose weight, and 95% of people who lose weight within a year gain it back. So that tells us something, and it's telling us that there's some kind of a set point. And if there's a set point, that would have to be programmed in during development. The whole system is under very tight control of hormones that are telling the body how many fat cells to make and exactly when to make them. So if you get an environmental chemical to come in and it can stimulate that pathway when it shouldn't be stimulated and therefore cause you to have more fat cells. And because that's happening during development when the fat cells are being made, then that effect is actually permanent. So the chemical is long gone, but the effect of that chemical lasts forever. We think what's happening is that the endocrine disruptors are actually stimulating the pathway to make stem cells become fat cells. So then you have more fat cells, and if you have more fat cells, they tend to want to be filled up with fat.
Une dizaine de substances peuvent rendre rats et souris obèses, même à faible dose. Plusieurs pesticides, le bisphénol A et l'acide de perfluorooctane, qu'on trouve notamment dans les revêtements type Téflon.
So far, there's actually quite a small list because this whole field is only about 5 years old. But it looks like every time you increase the female hormone estrogen during development, that sensitizes you for obesity.
C'est là que le destin de l'être humain standard s'éloigne de celui du rat de laboratoire. Nous sommes exposés à des perturbateurs endocriniens qui imitent les oestrogènes, bloquent la testostérone ou perturbent les hormones thyroïdiennes, à de très faibles doses, certes, mais tous les jours, toute la vie et surtout en même temps. Un cocktail à la saveur modernité et aux effets pas vraiment grisants.
We are not exposed to one agent at a time. You and I, we are exposed every day to perhaps thousands of chemicals, certainly hundreds of chemicals, and some of those will act in concert. Some of those may not, may actually counteract each other. So it is extremely complicated research question.
We are all exposed to a cocktail. However, when we identify a specific chemical that causes a problem, we need to understand not only how that can affect us in isolation, but how it affects us in the presence of many other chemicals. So scientists are doing studies now where they are looking at mixtures of chemicals and trying to understand what they will do. And in many cases, when we are at environmentally relevant doses, we find that the effects of chemicals appear to act in an additive fashion.
Toxicology has the tendency to evaluate the effects of chemicals in isolation, a single chemical, certain effects. And for a long time it has been neglected to ask the question what happens when many chemicals work together, and this is where we made a contribution. And now it turns out that it is possible that very low doses of chemicals, many chemicals together, can still have a pronounced effect.
Dans son laboratoire, Andreas Kortenkamp choisit des perturbateurs endocriniens à des doses si infimes qu'ils ne produisent aucun effet dans un tube à essai ou sur des bébés rats. Puis, il prépare un cocktail de produits qui bloquent la testostérone, disons un phtalate, 2 pesticides, un médicament. Et là, ces doses censées être inoffensives réduisent la distance anogénitale et provoquent malformation du pénis et des testicules.
Now, my colleague Earl Gray has called this the new mathematics. 0 plus 0 plus 0 is something. And it is not really new mathematics, but it encapsulates this quite nicely and quite provocatively. What it tells you is that if the effects of combinations are ignored, then we are in danger of making wrong assumptions about real existing risks. I feel many people, when they hear about mixtures, they bury their heads in their hands and say, oh, this is too complicated, too many chemicals, we don't know where to start. But I think we are now in a position where we can bring back some order into this seeming chaos by saying many of these effects are predictable, and also now we have the tools to highlight chemicals that contribute very much to a mixture effect. The implications of our work for regulation and risk assessment is quite important. There's no doubt that when you take mixture effects into consideration, risk estimates will go up.
I think all the data in animals and the data we have in humans is leading us to believe that this is going to be a significant problem in human health.
If it happens in mice, and it happens in rats, and it happens in monkeys, guess what? It will happen in humans, most likely.
The work that I've been doing and my colleagues have been doing now for 20 years, I would say, is finding more and more evidence that they do have effects on our bodies, and particularly on the unborn fetus. Significant effects that may seem to be related to a number of pretty alarming trends in health.
Et les tendances dans les pays riches depuis une cinquantaine d'années, elles ont comme un air de déjà-vu. Les anomalies de l'appareil génital masculin ont doublé. Le cancer des testicules est devenu le premier cancer chez l'homme jeune. La fertilité s'est effondrée de moitié. Le cancer de la prostate a, lui, quadruplé. Côté femme, il n'y a pas que le cancer du sein. Chez les fillettes américaines, les premiers signes de puberté apparaissent déjà entre 8 et 9 ans. Chez les adultes, le syndrome des ovaires polykystiques, l'endométriose et les fausses couches perturbent la fertilité. Un enfant européen sur 5 et plus d'un adulte sur 10 est obèse. Le diabète augmente de 5% par an. Il y a aussi les maladies cardiovasculaires, les altérations du système immunitaire, l'asthme et les problèmes thyroïdiens. Sans oublier l'hyperactivité, les déficits d'apprentissage et les troubles du comportement qui semblent augmenter chez les enfants. C'est-à-dire les mêmes maladies, ou presque, que celles des animaux de laboratoire exposés aux perturbateurs endocriniens.
I believe there is now sufficient scientific evidence to move into taking action or considering how we should take account of mixture effects and probably reform some decision-making procedures.
It's a very serious problem that we created and we have to deal with. So, I think once all this is said, the Europeans came up with the precautionary principle that is a wonderful tool. So why on earth don't we use it? Why don't we use it?
À l'exception notable du Danemark, qui édite un guide à l'intention des femmes enceintes, les pouvoirs publics ne sont ni très réactifs ni très bavards sur la question. Alors les gens sont contraints de bricoler des solutions dans leur coin à partir de bribes d'informations. Impossible de savoir s'il y a des phtalates dans ses tongs, du bisphénol A dans son rasoir ou des PBDE dans la télécommande. Et les étiquettes, quand elles existent, restent souvent incompréhensibles pour le commun des mortels.
It's a constant struggle now for us to try to figure out where these things all are so we can get the word out to help reduce the exposure.
So what I do and what I recommend to people is that to the extent you can, eat unprocessed food. It fits nicely with the message to eat simply, eat locally, go to your farmer's market, eat organically. Actually, phthalates are in pesticides as well. Then not to bring things into your house that you don't actually need. So do you really need all these gadgets, all this plastic, all this polyvinyl? Can you buy a wooden toy instead of a plastic toy?
We should be careful with plastic tubing and with using fresh vegetables instead of canned vegetables, never microwaving anything in plastic. Things of that sort are simple to use. And there are websites now that you can go to and they will tell you which cosmetics and which lotions and things are low in the kind of chemicals that we think are endocrine disrupting chemicals.
And I would particularly recommend that women, young women that intend to become pregnant or pregnant women, that they should read as much as they can about these things so they can avoid, for instance, cosmetics. If I was a pregnant woman, I'm not sure I would use cosmetics. You and I could do a lot to avoid some chemicals, perhaps by getting information about the products we eat, and you could get information about cosmetics and so forth. But we cannot totally avoid getting these chemicals into us because food is probably a major source of chemicals for us.
That's very surprising to people. They say, well, how could plastic be in our food? Any material that comes in contact with food, in the processing of the food, in the packaging of the food, in the shipping, in the storage, in the cooking, any product that contains PVC will allow the food to pull off some of that PVC. We don't know exactly where this happens, but we do know by measuring food, as has been done in a number of studies, that it's in there.
In British television, they have made some experiments. They looked at measured certain chemicals in people who eat organic food and live a very healthy life, and compared this with people in urban situations, and very much to the shock of the people who eat organic food, they were higher in the levels of certain chemicals in their blood. They were very frustrated and devastated. How can this be? This is because there's certain exposure routes which we cannot control through individual decision making.
Même armé de la meilleure volonté du monde, impossible de se protéger totalement de cette grande invasion chimique. À moins de revenir à l'état de nature, de retourner vivre dans des grottes ou de rejoindre une communauté amish comme il en existe aux États-Unis.
We have studied a community near here. They don't use any plastic, and they grow their own food. They don't actually drive cars either. There are also phthalates in cars. And they have very low levels of phthalates and bisphenol A. One woman had a higher level of one phthalate because she used hairspray, even though it wasn't really what she was supposed to be doing. And we saw that in her urine. They don't generally drive cars, but the two women that reported they had driven in cars recently had higher levels of some phthalates. So we know that you can, if you went to extremes, eliminate these. These are not permanent. These are not persistent chemicals. They're not like DDT.
There's no way. Individual avoidance action will not protect you from exposure to these chemicals, and that is why it is so important that we have concerted, protective, political regulatory action. It is not possible without.
We try to work as closely as we can with regulatory agencies to produce the best data that will be useful to them. But we don't have an ability to tell them what to do.
It is often very frustrating to see how little impact on political or regulatory action a lot of scientific work has had. This is true for the area I work in, which is the health impact of chemicals. But it is also true, say, for other areas, global warming, climate scientists. For years, what they've said had zero impact on political action.
In an ideal world, we would have never got to where we are today. And I think we got here because we just let industry put out chemicals without proper testing.
Just to think that we can have 200 types of detergent, I don't think it's good. I think that, yeah, from the economical viewpoint, if I want to make my wealth or my life selling detergent, I will have to make a detergent that is different from the one that Joe next door is selling, right? But how does it compare? I mean, my right to make $1 or to make an euro with the right of other people not to be intoxicated. So we have to decide certain things that are basic rights.
It is not helpful to enter this dialogue by saying industrialists are vicious or personally bad, or saying the same to regulators. It is the system.
Hello, I'm Mr. Money. I'm Mr. Money.
Now, it is understandable that when we come along as scientists and say, excuse me, we think you should abandon production of this kind of chemical, we will not be welcomed with open arms. Everyone can see this.
I'm a little concerned that we are just actively getting us to extinction because of the things we do in our arrogance, and it's a very bad combination, being arrogant and ignorant.
Yes, chemistry has changed the world we live in.
If I developed a protocol and I would expose pregnant women and small children to small doses of pesticides, the doses that you would get in food, or if you live nearby fields that are being sprayed and the drinking water is polluted a little bit, and I went to my university ethical review committee and asked them, please, can I do this experiment? They would say, you're crazy. You cannot expose pregnant women and little children to those sorts of substances because there's a risk involved. These substances may be neurotoxic. And my problem is, this is what's happening already. And therefore, I think the only conclusion is that we are actually committing something unethical. This experiment that we are, part of, essentially, is unethical.
It takes the determination of a society to make this change. I think I have confidence that we can do this, but it's going to take everyone understanding why the old way isn't working anymore. It is a major change. Yeah.
In this new world of industrial chemistry, the horizon is unlimited. Unexplored potentialities beckon. Hidden secrets of nature sound a call to this young man, the industrial chemist, the pioneer of tomorrow.